Bem-vindos a todos aqui ao Congrega. É um prazer para mim estar aqui no Congrega a apresentar Naoris Protocol e obrigado a todas as pessoas que nos juntaram a nós para o painel já a seguir e a todos vós tiraram o tempo para vir aqui ao evento para nós falarmos de algo um bocadinho diferente. Então, eu já me apresento, mas Naoris Protocol é aquilo que nós chamamos de Universal Trust Layer. Eu vou falar aqui, esta apresentação, vou fazê-la em inglês, se não se importam, porque isto vai ser muito complicado a saltar de inglês para português com todos os pontos. So it's the Universal Trust Layer for digital systems. It's the world's first post-quantum sub-zero blockchain. I'll explain what that means in a moment. Powered by Decentralized Cybersecurity mesh, so a number of new concepts that I'll explain. It brings together a number of technologies that normally are kind of like their own vertical, and some of them quite nascent. So it brings AI, it brings blockchain, it brings post-quantum capabilities or cryptography, and it also brings cybersecurity together. So in the bottom of the screen, you can see a number of incubators, let's say, or technology incubators that we're part of since 2018. We have participated in most of them in 2020, 2021. Some of the biggest technology accelerators in the world, some of them backed by either nation states or other entities, quite large entities. We applied, or we were fortunate to apply just before COVID to about 15 of them. We were accepted in 12 of them, and we won 9 of them. And in many different areas, from telecommunications to banking, to critical infrastructure, to defense. And the objective of this was to basically do what we call MVPs, or minimum viable products, that basically proved that the technology worked under certain situations of stress, and the overview from, let's say, some giants of international business. So a little bit about myself and the CSO. So I've been an ethical hacker for 20 years. Meu nome é David Carvalho. I'm originally from Portugal. Ethical hacker, that's the good guys. I have been quote. I have been, back in the day, of course, I'm not that young anymore, but I was the youngest global CISO in Europe of a multi-billion-dollar company. Received some prizes around that, which is kind of weird. I've been advising a number of nation states on critical cybersecurity environments, like, for example, cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber espionage matters, also dealing with management of real-world events, and also legislation around a number of incidents. I've also been involved in pushing very large digital transformations from a cybersecurity perspective, usually using innovative technologies, at the time innovative, such as AI and other decentralization approaches, and I founded Naoris Protocol in the past. I've also been involved in R&D with a number of academic spaces, pushing out a number of papers, together with other researchers, both in the areas of mathematics, in physics, and also in cybersecurity. David Holtzman, I'll present him in the next slide. So David Holtzman is our chief of strategy. He is, of course, a very interesting personality. He ran the world internet, the whole internet for the world until the year 2000. He was the former CFO of IBM, CTO of IBM, apologies. And he was an advisor to 3 presidential candidates to the White House in the US. He also created the DNS system and other supporting protocols for the internet. So an all-around very interesting guy. He also was breaking codes during the Cold War in nuclear submarines. Lots of interesting stories. Kjell Grønhagen actually was one of the, let's say, founders of the idea of the company. He's the former chief of intelligence of NATO. So we met in my previous engagements with the organization. So in his position as former chairman of NATO Intelligence Committee, he was a very strategic person. So we thought that bringing these technologies together was extremely strategic for the alliance. And we decided to bring him in very early. We are now working with his son, Knut Grønhagen, that is in charge of the Norwegian Cyber Command. Mick Mulvaney is, of course, the former chief of staff of the White House, which is also, let's say, a partner, an investor, and an advisor in the company. And Ahmed Bradachami is basically the equivalent of the Prime Minister of Morocco, if there's such a thing, and he's the former CEO of Microsoft North Africa and the president of Southeast Asia of Microsoft as well. And it's a pleasure to have him in the team as well. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. So what is the main problem? The problem is, for me, it's kind of obvious. For many people, it's because it's hard to touch. It's not as easy to understand. So by 2025, cybercrime will cost about $10 trillion to the world. It's probably going to be more than this. It's already about 8.5. We're looking at an explosion of smart devices, IoT, right? Everybody knows, Internet of Trouble. And all of them have a capability to be potential points of failure to the network where they reside, which is true for any digital device that is connected to a network these days. Now, this is nobody's fault. This is just how networks are done and how the internet is done or made. Every device is a point of entry, let's say, for a potential attacker, either internal or external. If you look at this number, it's quite a staggering number. It's about 6% of the world's GDP. It's the biggest loss that humanity has ever had that is not a war. If it was a nation, it would be the third biggest economy in the world. So there is a key problem, as we understand it, which has to do with centralization. So as I mentioned, central points of failure are basically what the world is made of. In digital systems, and since the very beginning, we have been trying to deal with problems around security, right? We have been trying to deal with problems around security in networks, in access control, in cryptography, so on. Basically to protect everything that's important or needs to be secret or that's critical for society. And what happens is that we never really focused much on trust. And I would argue that security comes from trust. And what we have created is basically kind of like a universal decentralized trust machine, okay, that uses advanced cryptography and mathematics to prove let's say in a cryptographic way, highly resilient cryptographic way, that the system A can talk to system B and they are both in a trusted state. Currently, that's not a possibility. So the problem with centralization is related to about 99.999% the infrastructure that we have in the world right now. Obviously, things that are decentralized currently tend to be related to blockchains. There are some other federated systems which are not really decentralized, let's say, that can be related to cloud or things like that. They have their own issues. In this case, there is some fundamental problems that come from this. First of all, it's very hard to trust an infrastructure that's very complex. So the more devices that are in an infrastructure, the more complexity there is, the easier it is to attack. So the more points of entries there are, the harder it is to manage. And it's really, really hard to know if you can trust any of those points. And normally you wouldn't have either the human power or the technical capability to do that. And even if you did, that capability would be centralized and itself would be a point of failure to the environment. So the idea to change this principle and bringing, for example, decentralization and blockchain principles into the ecosystem was actually an idea that came from myself and the former chief of intelligence of NATO. And he thought, wouldn't it be interesting if different countries that are part of the NATO alliance that act a single point of failure to each other, because they all connect to the same networks and they have access to the same control systems, wouldn't be actually a point of failure to each other. So countries like, for example, Portugal, that invest less in cyber, wouldn't or couldn't be, let's say, a weak point in the whole NATO infrastructure. That's a great idea. Now, the way to do that, from our perspective, is to use decentralization, DLT, blockchain systems, and consensus mechanisms, and that's what we have created. Now, we started that from a defense perspective, and then we moved that into a more of an enterprise level environment or government level, which tends to be vulnerable to the same sort of threats that the defense environments are vulnerable to. It takes about 277 days to detect a breach currently. I know it's an incredibly long time. And according to the last report from IBM, our partner, this number is probably going up. But this number is for the United States, which is probably the most well-defended environment in the world, or the most mature, let's say, from a cyber resilience perspective, around the critical infrastructure and industry, etc. In Europe, it's more than a year, and in other continents, it's hard to estimate. So that's basically the time to live, let's say, that attackers have within the systems, which basically gives them ample time to move laterally and vertically across organizations, take over accesses, exfiltrate data, which means stealing data or intellectual property or other things, or actually ransomwaring the whole system. It's really limited to the attacker's imagination. All these problems actually come from a group of problems, but they come mainly from decentralization, from centralization. So systems must evolve from castles to communities. So this is a very interesting image. So in here, we have basically the traditional system, which is the original model, where you have like, and there's nothing wrong with this inherently, which is firewalls and antiviruses and so on, and best practice and enforcement of accesses. Best case scenario, many companies don't have even this. And the model is thought to be centralized as in kind of like a castle. But the thing is that today, companies, governments, critical infrastructure don't operate like this. There are many points of access to these systems that are traveling around. People are using mobile phones, they are using laptops, they are in airports, they're flying around, they're working from home, and you have no idea if their environments are actually secure at any point, even though they might have access to the critical environments. So the interesting thing is that all the environments that exist today, or most of them, are already here. They just don't know it. They are working in a centralized way. So what we allow for is for them to have multi-party systems that the more devices, and that's the power of decentralization, really the more complexity there is, the more devices there are, the more validators of trust there are. So they act like an army. So instead of just being a collection of points of failure, for example, best practice rules around compliance and security and so on can actually be guaranteed by the whole. So the more complexity you have, the more resiliency you have kind of exponentially. And this is pretty much the opposite of the traditional model, where it's really hard to trust any single device because of the centralization issue. Even the validation structure that might exist itself is centralized, and it's hard to trust, and it's easy to manipulate from an attacker's perspective. So we help companies, environments, infrastructures, governments, airports, you name it, to decentralize their physical infrastructure and go into what we call a DPIN world, which is decentralized physical infrastructure world, where their whole infrastructure acts as a trust-generating environment, right? That uses its own complexity instead for creating risk, which is the traditional approach, which is nobody's fault, into making it a more resilient and highly validated infrastructure. And there's other things that I would like to talk about. One of them is the quantum threat, or Q-Day. So in the beginning of the year, I called a number of the generals that advise us, including early ones that were involved in the company from the NATO side, and I asked, what is the biggest threat to your critical infrastructure? What is the biggest threat to your defense ecosystem and to your government that you see in the next year or two? And almost all of them said, actually indirectly all of them said, the biggest threat that we see is actually a cryptographic threat, which is that a quantum computer with enough qubits or a quantum singularity or whatever you want to call it will happen or has already happened, and that allows other nation states or forces to have access to all our data. And so what does that mean? It means that once this happens, if it didn't happen already, because I have access to, or we have access to some intelligence groups that are telling us that to an extent this has already happened in a provable way, they basically tell us that in the next, or even NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, have come out and said that they believe this threat, they increased the threat level from medium to extremely high, I believe last year in October. They believe that there is a 75% probability that in the next 3 years, or 1 to 3 years, there's going to be this capability somewhere that will lead to the breaking of elliptic curve cryptography, which is basically all cryptography that exists, And obviously NIST defines cryptographic standards for the world in general, for defense, for banking, for government, for really anything that matters. They believe that that's going to be broken. And once that's broken, well, everything, everywhere, at the same time is going to be accessible by a third party. So that means that there are no more secrets under any sort of vertical. This would be probably like the year 2000 bug, but for real, like much worse than that. We have worked very hard with various academic colleagues, mainly in the United States, to create the world's first post-quantum consensus on a blockchain for these critical environments. So for airports, for oil and gas, for electricity environments, for water and sanitation, et cetera, and smart cities. And we're very happy to be in production with that since about February. We actually presented the paper with the IEEE Foundation in South Africa last year in October, exactly about this. So they chose our paper, they chose about 2% of the papers, and we presented in the conference, and it went quite well. So this is an example here of a quantum attack scenario that we like to give, that was actually borrowed from a slide of a defense partner of ours. So there was, for example, the Texas winter storm, if you guys remember, in February 2021. It was unprecedented, but it was possible to manage it to an extent. The whole state was without power. People died. Well, it was a short-term power loss, but it created lots of supply chain issues because it created what we call a cascading effect that would happen with the cyber attack, the same thing, that leads to other things failing because obviously power is at the root of most things. The financial impact is estimated to be at least $200 billion in that case, and it was a short thing. So a quantum attack on the SCADA protocol could create similar sort of events, but they would be potentially managed by the attacker, not by nature. So then this can happen, well, I would say it will happen eventually, either at nation state level because of some sort of conflict. You know, in my environment, something that I've been doing for a long time is actually malware reverse engineering, which also is related to cyber weapons. And we know, or at least people in our space know, that most nation states have access to what they think is unique to them, which in this case are 0 days, that they have inside critical infrastructure of other nation states. That during, for example, a conflict or an extreme situation, they would be able to cripple their adversary. Now, they probably all have it between each other. So this would be kind of like a zero-sum game. Even though they believe that they are the only ones that have it, probably the others also have it. So the example that's put here is that it's similar to an electromagnetic pulse. Actually, on this military conference that I was in London, there was a study done in 79, that if there was an EMP, so an explosion of a nuclear weapon in space over the United States at certain altitude, it would create an electromagnetic pulse, which would basically take away all electric power from all things and burn all circuits. And they estimated that in urban areas with more than 1 million people on that study, they would have 98% mortality in a month. And outside of that, it would be about 90% mortality. So they said that was probably much worse than a direct nuclear attack. In the example of, for example, a quantum attack against the SCADA protocol, it would basically allow them unfettered access to the whole infrastructure and allow it to either shut it down, destroy it, ransom it, whatever. So it would be similar to an electromagnetic pulse attack. This is just an example. It would be potentially irrecoverable from so it would be a survivability event. There would be direct economic cost of about $8.6 trillion according to their study over 18 months. And the GDP at risk would be about $20 trillion for more than 8 years. So they estimated that it would take 8 to 10 years to recover. This would be an entire year's output to the US economy. And this excludes any human losses, as I mentioned before, which would be probably quite high, and lots of civil unrest and the global impact from a US economy meltdown, let's say, which in this case, it's the reserve currency of the world. All right, so we talk about the solution now. So the post-quantum sub-zero trust layer. What is a post-quantum sub-zero trust layer? So what we created with our partners under mandates from former leaders of NATO was a layer of blockchain that is below other layers. So just to give you an idea, there's various blockchain layers. For example, Bitcoin is a layer 1 blockchain. Say, for example, there are other there's other blockchains that operate at higher layers that are not as interesting. There's layer 3, which is decentralized applications, and then there's layer 0, which is kind of like the same thing as for example, layer 1, but a little bit different. We are a sub-zero layer, so that means that we operate below those layers as a blockchain, and that means that we can operate directly with decentralized systems. So as a blockchain, we don't do transactions of NFTs of cats, or sending Bitcoins from here to there, or just putting data in an immutable state. Our objective is to ensure that systems and data are actually in a trusted state for them to operate. So it's a very different use case for blockchain technology. I believe it's the first use case in this area. And of course, this has consequences on the trust area. So it, for the first time, allows different infrastructures to validate each other from a governance, risk, compliance perspective. Say, for example, a regulator of power to regulate the companies below them. For example, a government regulator, without sending any auditor there, in a way that uses this technology as kind of like an auditor that exists already in every system and interrogates them for best practice, for example, in making sure that laws and compliance is being followed, all the way to guaranteeing that the processes, the data, and the operations in these environments that are basically, for example, being fed into an AI system or a command and control system or some sort of dashboard are actually correct and have been made immutable, and the original systems that created it, transformed it, and then sent it are actually in a trusted state and they haven't been tampered with, or at least they are following best practice from a cybersecurity perspective, which currently doesn't exist. There's no capability to do this traditionally with the kind of, how can I say, confidence that such critical environments require. Now, this is completely transformative for the space. It's a different way of looking at risk. Now, I understand that everybody here might not be technical, such as myself, but you understand risk. And this is about risk mitigation directly. Risk mitigation with technology. So what our technology does is we allow to environments of any kind, any digital environment, to integrate with us and basically ensure and mathematically prove that their systems that are generating the data that is being fed to the government or being used to, for example, stabilize a power grid or manage, for example, ports and rail, etc., is actually good data. It hasn't been tampered by anybody. It's timely, and it comes from trusted infrastructures. Now, that, again, was never possible before. So this is really why we call it the universal trust layer, because in the end, every device that was before potentially a point of failure is part of what we call a decentralized cybersecurity mesh, okay? So it basically, it becomes, let's say, a hive mind of trust that mathematically proves that everything is in the correct state. Naoris Protocol creates a number of new possibilities. I mentioned about some of these before. So we allow for real-time device validation, making sure that these devices monitored and validated even to post-quantum level. So even if there was an attacker that was tampering with the system or tampering with the data or even the validation structure, they would have a hard time doing that because of the post-quantum consensus, which is resistant theoretically to quantum attacks. We are working with NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, that I mentioned before. We have some people in our team from there on this. The integration is pretty seamless, so it already works with existing environments, including IoT. I'm going to show here a video actually from an integration that we have done with T-Mobile. This is kind of like an overview of the architecture. So you have, let's see if I have a laser. Yes, I do. Excellent. So you have devices. They have agents, or they can also work agentless if they are kind of like very light devices, let's say, like a Raspberry Pi level or even smaller, like an IoT device. They all have validator nodes that basically ensure integrity in a decentralized way, that there is nothing malicious like malware running, there's no vulnerabilities present and things like this, and that the device operations are trusted. And that connects directly to our consensus mechanism, which is really interesting, which we have created together with various academic spaces in the US. That's called Decentralized Proof of Security, or dPoSec, which is a very different consensus mechanism than what you would have in other blockchains. It's completely green. There is no, basically almost no computing used. It's very, very, very light. And it allows for the basically the assurance of all these things: trust, confidentiality, integrity, availability of the whole infrastructure in a transparent way for anybody to manage. That allows then internal environments and then partners or regulators, suppliers, governments, customers, or enterprises to have transparent visibility over potentially their third parties, their internal networks, their cloud, in a provable way. So in our experience, once a customer has proof that their operations are actually good, it's hard for them not to have proof that they're actually good. It's hard for them to go back. In this video, we actually presented on the T-Mobile conference. That was the biggest telecommunications competition in the world that we won, based in Bonn, in Germany. So this is a representation of what actually happens in our environment. This is our consensus mechanism, how the nodes work. Then there is an AI system that we call Swarm AI. That's decentralized, that learns over the systems. What you're looking in the screen is a decentralized cybersecurity mesh with many kinds of devices. There's robotic arms, there's drones, there's 5G home internet, there's servers in the cloud, virtual systems, etc. In this case, there is an attack against the system. We actually use the cyber weapon from a group that's friendly to ours from Ukraine, that was actually used against Ukraine by Russia in the beginning of the war, that was undetectable. We used that against a robotic arm that was actually in India, so in a different network. And the devices that are in the same network immediately detect this. Now, the interesting thing is that that threat was not detected, that was normally undetectable. The interesting thing is that the detection was done from outside in. So normally it is the device that is tampered with that tells you, something's happening. But you cannot trust the device that's tampered with. And we have changed this paradigm, so you don't have to trust that device. That's the only one you can trust. So in this example, we had a number of backups that we had set up. We had smart contracts on the blockchain that basically did the response as well. And they were automatically triggered. And the device was isolated from the network. The threat was learned. And all the other devices are now protected against it. They are aware of that kind of threat. We know exactly threat intelligence is added to the swarm, so it's now part of the blockchain. It can be audited in the future. It's immutable. The swarm AI has learned with it, which means that all devices are now protected, even though they are in different networks, and they might be in different companies, and they might not have direct access to each other's networks. So this is a peer-to-peer system. In this system, the system is restored, in this example, from backup. We knew exactly how its previous state was, and all without any human interaction. Normally, in this part of a POC we did, normally this would probably take well, it's hard to say, but the 277 days is the average for a detection of something. This would be the beginning of the attack. What that attack did was actually it tampered with the robotic arm that actually was in a factory that built helicopters, and it destroyed everything around it. So it destroyed other robotic arms, it destroyed helicopters, whatever. So it's an example of a cyber weapon that actually just a virus can have real world impact in a multi-billion-dollar assembly line. Anyways, normally that process would take, it's hard to say, could take a very long time. And in this case, it would take, we're talking about 10 milliseconds to 2 seconds, depending on the distance on the networks. So very quickly how it works. As I mentioned before, there is an agent that interrogates quickly the systems. There's a validator network that is completely novel in the approach that allows for every participant or every device to have a node and eliminate the need to trust a single point. Then that's backed potentially, if the customer wants to, by post-quantum capability. That makes it harder to tamper with the data. And it uses the decentralized Swarm AI system, which is very interesting. It allows to learn from edge computing. So normally things that how can I say, the computation is distributed. It allows for instant learning instead of centralizing the data somewhere else. That can lead to problems, for example, especially in critical infrastructure or these highly regulated spaces, of data going into areas that are untrusted. Say, for example, the critical infrastructure is in Portugal and the company that's doing the log analysis is in the US or in another country, and they don't really know what they're doing with the data. So the data sovereignty part is really important, and our customers really care about that. So very quickly here about the decentralized trust mesh. It's a product that applies to Web 2 and Web 3. That means decentralized and centralized systems. And we decentralize them in the end from a perspective of trust. It's an academia-backed technology. We have a number of papers backing this. And it is an infrastructure that can be incentivized. So basically there can be, this is more not from a private blockchain perspective, but from a public blockchain perspective. It allows for digital transformation in a kind of like future-ready way. So it allows for a digital leapfrog from all the difficulties that exist today, or some of them are actually mitigated by this immediately. And you can leapfrog a number of difficulties technologically that have to do with centralization. I mentioned a number of them, and go directly into decentralization, post-quantum, and some other kind of like next-gen technologies. We, of course, don't tell anybody to take away anything that they have. This is just another layer in what we call the defense in-depth strategy in cybersecurity, where you want as many layers as possible. This is a validation layer that validates all the previous layers. So it's not because you have a good antivirus, for example, that you shouldn't have a good password or that you shouldn't have a good firewall, right? This is another layer that prevents other problems. So, as I mentioned before, the quantum space race is here. There is major investment from a number of countries in this area. Tens and tens of billions, mainly in Asia and also in the US. These are a number of things that we have done in post-quantum around digital identity, multi-party approval, so authentication and authorization approaches, quantum-safe cryptography, verified messaging on a post-quantum level, and also a wrapper, so it works with any sort of environment. Some of our partnerships here from a number of areas. So from smart cars to robotics to supply chains, defense, etc. We have recently made a partnership with IBM, T-Mobile also. Level Robotics, they make the robotic arms that basically make cars in Tesla and General Motors and so on. They're one of our first investors. Cypher is about $200 billion family office bank. The CFO is our CFO is their president. BDO is the 5th biggest consultancy company in the world. And Nexia is the 7th, I believe. We have raised 31 million to date. We're actually raising more, another 40. And we have already revenue since February. And this is the pipeline we have for this year. And I think, we're only halfway through the year. So there's been quite a bit of interest. Again, to our partners, some of the people in the team, and a number of advisors here, as I mentioned before, Mr. Inge, the former chief of the Norwegian Armed Forces, Cyber Defense, Norwegian Cyber Command, former one of the people that were in NIST, some of the best hackers in the world, etc. So thank you so much, and that was it. Thank you.